Hi everyone, it's Natalie here. So I got my cup of tea and I'm ready to do part two of What Are Your Clairs? So in the first response to the hashtag, I really just kind of looked more or talked more about the way that they've impacted my life and different coping mechanisms and perspectives and ways of viewing them, but without really going into much detail about like, okay, so what have you actually experienced? So I thought, especially after watching some other videos, which I didn't get a chance to comment on, but which I've really enjoyed and learned a lot from, I realized like, oh, other people are really just talking about what are their what have been their experiences. So I thought today I would just be a little bit more informal and just talk about that. Um, so with regards to like different experiences that I've had of the simplest ones to talk about, I think probably would be the clairaudient ones because they're rarer and more bizarre, I guess, is probably the word I want. So the first one that I really remember having, I was in grad school at Lambda, and we were rehearsing in the basement of an old pub. And I was sitting eating, we were rehearsing a play called Landscape of the Body, which was a lot of fun. And I was sitting on the floor eating dried, pitted dates. And happily just reading my script and hanging out with some of my buddies and enjoying our time, not having to do anything while someone else was working. And while I was sitting there chomping away on the dates, I heard this voice right in my right ear, like it was someone whispering right in my ear. I mean, it was very audible. It said in a very British accent, "There's a pip in that one." And Americans don't say pip, we say pit. So that was weird. I knew it wasn't me, and it was a very kind of working class voice, and it seemed female. And sure enough, as I took a bite, I mean, I was eating and I was taking a bite. Just as I took that bite, I bit right into the pit of the date, which was so weird. Like, if you're going to talk to somebody, why would you know what I mean? Why would you do it then? It was really weird. It was just really weird. So anyway, that was one. And it just was, it seemed so random and insignificant. And I think that's why it really stood out to me at that point, but it was also correct. And I didn't audibly hear the laughter afterwards. I would say afterwards there was uproarious laughter, but I didn't hear it. It was more that I sensed or felt it, and I knew I was being laughed at. And somebody was getting, I don't know what it was. I was used to, when I lived in Britain, I was very accustomed to being laughed at and made fun of for being American. If you're American or foreigner of any kind, or at least when I lived there, you're an excellent target for for humor that's both really gentle natured and just kind of poking fun affectionately, as well as like kind of a deep seated aggression and anger towards a particular group of people. So anyway, it felt more like it was not well intended. What do we want to say? It was kind of harmless. It was just harmless. So there was that. And then the other moment of clairaudience that I remember having, I'm trying to remember if that was all it was. It was also right ear. But it felt like it was more coming from inside my right ear. And this time I couldn't have told you like who the voice was. This was several years later, maybe 9 years later. Like after that, it was like, it was within the last, say, 6 months of when I was going to be living in Britain, actually. It might have happened maybe in like April, March or April of 2008, and I left in July. So it was within the last few months of my living in Britain. I had a fiance we were visiting his family down in Devon, and they had suggested, maybe we could all go to Exeter for the day, or maybe the two of you should go to Exeter for the day. So we'd gotten on the train and we'd gone to Exeter for the day. And, this ex-fiance he had his own issues, some of which were kind of severe. He had some serious like depression and like self-esteem related issues that he was working on with a therapist, but which were still, there wasn't a lot in terms of skill and his ability to manage things when they were coming up at the moment. And we'd gone down a really narrow alleyway and into a shop that was like at the corner. Not the corner, like if it was kind of like winding, and then it kind of like narrowed, and watching my fingers, it kind of narrowed into this little spot, and you'd kind of go down. It was very medieval looking. Go down this couple of stairs, and there were these doors, and the doors must have been 15 feet tall, probably, and they were very long and skinny and narrow, probably about the same, width as what would happen in standard doors, but because the doorway itself was so tall, the doors seemed tall and skinny. Anyway, on both on both stone walls on either side of this little like alleyway area, there were antiques hanging on the walls, and they were just covered. Every wall space that was available at the entrance to this little place, at the end of this alleyway, was covered with chairs, furniture, bookshelves, dressers. I mean, they were, hung up everywhere you could see. And the effect was really stunning. It was beautiful to look at. It was really intriguing. It really drew you in towards the store. So that was clearly why they did it. And I remember we went in, and there were also, then when we got in there, it wasn't all just like furniture antiques. They had a lot of clothes. So we went in, we were looking at clothing and stuff, and I wanted, he was always wanting to change his look. He was always, very different than the sort of person I'm attracted to now. Always wanting to, self-critical and so on. And anyway, within 5-10 minutes of walking around the store, he'd worked himself into such a place of like self-hatred and self-detriment. It was just all he could do to cope with being in there. None of my attempts at kind of calming him down or being patient seemed to have any real effect. So I remember he was going to leave the store. I still wanted to look around, but that wasn't really on the books. I had the sense at that time I needed to follow him. And I couldn't have told you why. It would have been more likely that I would have stayed in the store and just hung out and done what I wanted to do and found him later. But I didn't. I decided I was going to go after him. And I was close behind him, so I wasn't very far behind. But just as I was trying to leave and get out the door, I remembered there was an old lady. It was a mom with a baby carriage that was really way too big to try and get into this kind of a small, little shop. And then on the other end of it, so it was like mom, baby, and baby pram, and then granny. And James went out first, then they came in, and then I went after him. And I remembered thinking that they were really irritated that he pushed past them instead of helping them get in the door, which is interesting too. The timing of all of this was very specific and significant. But I remember when he opened the door and it kind of pushed and kind of slammed, it knocked against something, like one of the things that was hanging on that wall. And so then as I was walking out the door, like after him, I think I was the third person to actually end up kind of knocking against, which is interesting that there was a 3. I was the third person to knock against it because I waited for the mom and the baby and the grandmother to get in before then opening the door and kind of pushing it out, to get out of there. And I heard it kind of smack against something. And I stopped because then I heard a second sound. I mean, this was all within the space of seconds. I heard another sound kind of happen. I mean, it was even split seconds, right? So door slams, I hear it slam and hit something. There's another noise, and then there's this voice in my ear, and it was like time just went, and kind of suspended, and then it happened. But in that suspended space, this voice in my ear, as though had someone holding my shoulders and just whispering right into my ear, said, and it's so visual because that moment was so visual. And my brain, sometimes if something's really visual, it's hard for me to find the language or words. It seems to me that it's almost one or the other. Either it's language or visual. As I recall, the voice said, "Don't move, just stay still." And so, because my instinct was to look up, so I stayed still and I relaxed. Sometimes I'll do that in dreams too. Something bad is about to happen and I'll think, it's okay, just relax, just relax. So I held still and I relaxed and I closed my eyes, and literally right at that moment, this probably 100-pound bookcase fell off the wall, hit me right on the bridge of my nose here, and bounced. If you can believe it. If I hadn't heard that voice and had that sense of someone right there saying, "Don't move, hold still," I would have looked up. And when I told the doctor that at the, accident and emergency, he said, if you had looked up at that moment, it wouldn't have hit you on the bridge of the nose. It probably would have gone straight in, and it may likely have killed you. So, and I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." And had I been like, I'm trying to remember what he said, if I'd been a little bit, just the tiniest bit further back, if it had hit just a little bit lower, it would have taken my nose off. So that would have been like extensive plastic surgery right there. And then what was the other? If I had looked down or moved my head down, it could have broken my neck or crushed my cranium. Any way you look at it, it would have been either deadly for me or it would have been deeply disfiguring and would have changed my entire life in a not great way. It could have left me paralyzed. I mean, there's a lot of things that could have happened right there. It hit me because the door hit it the third time. If I had not been the third person out of that door, it would have been either the mom, the baby, or the grandmother. So at the angles, and it's hard to explain if you're not there, but at the angles that they were coming into that store when they hit the door. So if James had gone out first, I'd gone out second after him. And then the third was the granny and the baby and the mom going in. It would have hit one of them and likely would have taken him out. It was just so weird. It was just one of those coincidental things. And all it did was just leave. I mean, it kind of, there was a lot of blood. It kind of cut, it definitely did some soft tissue damage. It cut my nose right at that spot. And I remember I had a black eye, all the way down here and a little bit, there. But 100-pound bookshelf bounced off my face, so I don't know. It was just weird. It's one of those things. So I would say at that moment, that was like clairaudience. That was a moment that saved my life, which is why it's significant enough to mention. And it really changed me anyway. I feel like that moment in particular really changed. And wow, that's funny because like I talk about it and I can feel the ache in my face just talking about it. And the sense memory of it is so, so visceral. But yeah, I mean, that was, it did change my life when that happened because it definitely was never the same after that. I think I learned to meditate right after that, and went through several like shamanic healing sessions with a friend of mine who was a practicing or well a shamanic practitioner, I guess, in the Antonio Villoldo tradition. And I think I remember now, like I went through some stuff with her after that happened that changed, as I recall, and look at like what did I agree to with that. May have had some influence on a lot of other things that happened afterwards. But those are two really interesting stories, and they're so interesting to me because one was so insignificant and yet it was so strong. Like the voice was almost in the room with me, just right next to me. The second one was as though the voice was right in my ear, like someone was talking quietly in my ear, as though they were holding my shoulders and standing right there. Whoever they were, thank you, because I could have died. I probably would have died or been paralyzed more likely. The second less horrible, thing that would have happened would have been just that my nose would have had to come off and there would have been plastic surgery. But either way you look at it, that it's pretty significant. And I definitely feel like I lived my life very differently after that happened. It shifted things a lot. Not all of the shifts happened right away, but within a couple of years, everything in my life was different. So, yeah, those were pretty big. In terms of clairvoyance, a lot of things have happened. A lot of things have come across. I sometimes will get precognitive flashes, that are visual and don't settle completely, but the instant that the something that I saw happens, I remember, oh, that's right, I did see that. And those will happen usually while I'm just sitting quietly or meditating. I'm not usually looking for it. I'm not usually poking that bear. They usually just kind of float through. When I was a medium, and I was actively practicing mediumship, the clairvoyance was really the number one way that spirit would come across. So I would see them and feel them, and so it'd be clairvoyant, clairsentient, and claircognizant, I would say, because it was just almost like a telepathy that was happening with the deceased person. And so sometimes I'd be watching them kind of like gesticulating and moving around or pointing to something, or like I'd get a slideshow going through my visual cortex kind of giving me information, or it would just be like I'd be taking in that information and then just kind of it would click in, and I would just know like, oh, there's this. Some moments of claircognizance are really bizarre. One in particular that I had was, it happened over a time period. I'm sometimes had to re-record a few videos because I'll realize, and I'm just checking, it's still recording. I'll realize that a video has stopped like recording while I'm talking, and I'll maybe have been talking for 15 minutes and then go, oh shit, I have to completely re-record this. What did I do? So I don't remember if I actually said this and then like posted it, or if I said it and didn't get it recorded, or it's who knows. But anyway, there's a story of like, I had a couple of years ago in 2016, I had a few people in my life die consecutively within 2 weeks or 8 days. Maybe I think it was 8 days, right around the election, the presidential election. And one was my godfather, one was an old friend and classmate from high school, and one was the partner of a colleague. And then concurrent with that, or like just prior to that, I'd had 3 really intense experiences with students at school who were it was basically like a suicide cluster, or a suicide attempt cluster. So thankfully nobody died, But the feelings of wanting to end one's life were really, really prominent in all three situations, and it was heartbreaking. And I ended up directly involved with two of those students and sort of peripherally involved with the third. Um, I love all three of them to this day, and I'm so grateful that they're still here. And I have no regrets about that, and about my involvement in it. It was really more that there was just a lot of contact with death and dying, all within a period. I think all of it together was in like 3 weeks. So it was a lot, and I didn't have a lot. I was directing a show. I didn't have a whole lot of space to process these things. And so it was really intense, and it started to really shift perceptions of things. So I'm trying to remember now where I was going with that. Oh yeah, claircognizance. So one morning I'd gotten up to go and teach a class and realized, oh no, we don't have all the space and all of the stuff that we're supposed to have in order to do this class, not because of my lack of preparation, but because the university wasn't very supportive. So we'd moved into this smaller classroom, and I thought, okay, today I know we'll talk about neuroscience in the brain and the way that these different parts of the brain function and what we're touching when we're working with acting and how that comes together and so on. So I did that because my interest was really in protecting and helping students protect themselves, psychologically and neurologically as they work. And in the midst of all of this, or towards the end of that class, a student that I knew not very well at all, actually, kind of piped up like she wanted to come and talk to me. And that happens a lot. And I generally love that, and I love making space for it, but I didn't have much space or time. And so I remember looking at her really evaluatively, and I saw very clearly, or I knew, it's not that I knew, oh, right, she wants to come and tell me about her rape experience, because we'd been talking about the impact of trauma and about what you need to do to protect yourself and deal with self-care and self-nourishment in those kinds of circumstances when you're working in acting. And I don't know how I knew that was what was going on. I just did. I just knew. And I remember very consciously having to stop myself from speaking directly to her and saying, oh, it's okay. I know you were raped. We don't have time to talk about this because I don't even have 5 minutes between now and when the next class comes in, and I've got to completely reset and pull everything back together, and they're coming in, and I've got this paperwork, and it was like 3 minutes, it was really, it was tough. It was really tough. And I did manage to stop myself, but it was like when she started talking and wanting to tell me this, and I realized at a certain point, okay, take a breath, Nat. You've got to just take a breath, relax, let her tell you what she needs to tell you. You don't need to interrupt. You don't need to say anything. Just listen. That's all that's necessary. So I did, and it was fine, and it ended up being, sensitively and gently handled, which is really what I wanted. But it was as though it was, when you get annoyed because someone is telling you information you already know, that was the challenge. It wasn't so much, it was that extra layer. So it wasn't so much that what she needed to tell me was difficult to hear. And it wasn't so much, that's already its own thing, right? And it wasn't so much that that I had a time limit, before the next group came in. That was there too. It was then the added layer of, and you're just going to tell me something I already know. Like when someone tries to explain something to you, you don't have time to take that information in, and it's already information you know, so there's really no need for them to tell you. That was the experience. And I love that student. We grew very close, and I'm so grateful that I was able to just shut up and pause and breathe it long enough to be able to just be with her so that I could hear her tell me. Um, it's like having already read something on the internet, or whatever, and I didn't know it. It wasn't something I could have known. It wasn't something that she had told anyone. But it was, yeah, it was just there. It was just like, oh, well, I already know this. It's fine. You don't have to tell me about it. Um, Around that same time period, I had a few experiences of the individuals who were deceased, like recently deceased, in that same time period, uh, talking to me. And I could both see them like in my head, like there's one moment where I was sitting in the car and the person that was the partner of the colleague, they were sitting in the seat, in the passenger seat, and they were telling me how to get to their house. Because I was there going, oh, which one is her house? Which one is her house? And they sat in the side seat and they were like, look, you gotta, and I was getting directions from them. And I could see them in my mind's eye and I could hear them kind of inside my ear, but not directly. It's interesting. I feel like most of the time when these things happen, it usually is right side. So I will see the person, through the peripheral vision on my right side, and or inside my, visual cortex. So not out in the space, but like in my mind, but in the visual cortex. So like if I were to look at a room, I can then close my eyes after looking at the room and recreate that, that space is recreated. It's still there in my visual cortex. Sometimes I'll do that and close my eyes and realize, wait a minute, there was somebody or something in the corner of the room. And if I won't see it visually like in the space, but if I close my eyes again, I can see where and what is there. And sometimes I'll then be able to turn, and as I turn, I can see that, in my peripheral vision. I have a few times seen things, people, things, not human things, unfortunately, out of my visual, like actually in the space, which I find to be a really uncomfortable experience, or used to. I'm less uncomfortable with it now. It used to be that I was terrified of having some kind of experience like that, and now I'm like, well, whatever, that happens. I mean, who cares? I know I'm not crazy, and I know that it's, it's something that people experience. So it doesn't really bother me if it does happen, and I don't depend on it to happen either way. So it's not a bear. Again, it's like not a bear that I poke. But I did once have an experience of seeing a thing in my garage, in my garage at my mom and dad's. And it was standing just outside the garage door. And I remember I walked outside the house and I, through this like little passway and into the garage. And it was, again, right side, and it was there. And I could see it out of the corner of my eye. And I remember I froze and I was, all of my attention was in that right peripheral vision, just kind of taking it in and kind of seeing like how much can I look over there without actually turning my head to look. And so I stayed with it and stayed with it. And then I finally turned and looked, and it was still there, but it was less, I could see through it. It was less easy to see. And then I remember when I turned and kind of looked, I turned to look and I moved my eyes back away so that it was still right there, but I could see it more through my peripheral vision, and I was able to take in more of it. It did go away. It did dissipate. I don't know what it was. It was kind of, I have a lot of theories about these things, but anyway, that's how that came across. And I forgot about this. This was a clairaudient moment too, but the friend from high school that died, she had a really complicated illness, and my sister and I decided to go to her funeral memorial service. And as we were sitting there, um, I had a sense of her. I could feel her in the room. Like I could feel that she was in the space, that her presence was there in the space. And within seconds, it's like that became a mutual, like, when you go into a room and somebody you know is in the room, but you haven't seen them yet, you have a sense, maybe a sense of them being there that you haven't fully pulled together. You haven't clicked it all together and gone looking for them. But the instant that they look at you, you're like, oh, I knew you were here. I knew you were here. It was that, but without the rest of it, like the embodied, I guess, aspects of it. Her name was Grace. And she was a really special person, a really cool person, really funny person, really difficult person in high school. And then, somebody who grew out of that and became an extraordinary human being, like a lot of people do. So, and we all sang in choir together. So it was funny. There was a vocalist at her funeral, and the vocalist occasionally would hit a note that, during her Ave Maria that was just a little bit off. And, my sister and Grace and I all knew that song really, really well. We'd all sung it at various different state competitions and stuff. And I swear she came up to me, but this time it was interestingly on my left. Maybe because my sister was sitting next to me, but she came like right up and she made a joke about it. Like it was impossible for it not to have been her. It sounded, I could hear her voice. I could hear her tone in her voice. It was crazy. She kind of, she was like, whoo, that was a bit of a note, huh? Like, whoo, she didn't quite manage to make it to that note, did she? That was a little bit, ooh, I don't know about that one. I mean, it was just like her, and it was phrased exactly the way that Grace would have said it. And it was so funny. It was so cool. So, yeah. And just as quickly as she was there, she was somewhere else. I don't know, but she wasn't with us. But I felt kind of like at some point she'd realized that we were there and was waiting for her moment to be able to come over and, have something to say or some way of connecting. And that happened to be that moment. So that was really neat. And it's not infrequent that I go to funerals and see the deceased person is in the room, because if I close my eyes, I'll realize that they're, like, oh, there they are. They're right there. And if I get close enough to the coffin, or we say casket over here, I guess. So, casket, I'll be able to hear them talking to someone, like out, in the room. That's been a fairly recent thing. Yeah, it's been more so since the 2016 kind of cluster around that it's been much more apparent. And then I would say finally, because this is going on forever, yeah, it's a long one. This is a hard one to talk about. I had I had an ex that committed suicide. He took his life by suicide. We're supposed to say, in the grief community and the death community, that he died by suicide, which I feel is definitely a much more heart-centered way of viewing the situation. I don't think anyone really follows through with suicide and completes it unless they're really that distressed and that upset. And so I am, of course, angry with him for doing it. But I get it and I understand it, and it's okay. But he went missing for a short time. And I didn't realize that. I didn't know that that had happened. My parents saw it on TV, and I was living in my tiny house at that time, and I don't have a TV down there. Um, I have internet, and I would stream things, but if I needed to watch the news or whatever, I would go up to their house and watch for a while, and whatever, or get it off the internet the way most people do. Anyway, I had been away for that weekend, I think, when he went missing and disappeared, and my family had seen it on the news and were frantically trying to get in touch with me to say, look, you should be aware that this is going on. And as soon as I was aware that he was missing and got through the moment of shock around it, I was flooded, as I kind of was questioning, like, what's going on with him. I knew he was still alive because I could feel him. So I don't know if that, if what I'm about to describe could be called clairvoyance or clairsentience or some kind of a combination. But I remember, this is a good way of describing it. In Star Wars, when Obi-Wan Kenobi says, Luke, reach out with your feelings, stretch out with your feelings. That is how I experience it sometimes. It's like there's a cord or a thread, that I can follow that takes me to a person or a situation or a place, or somewhere that I need to connect to or connect with. And this was like that. This was a situation very like that. But I remember kind of stringing out and feeling out for him and kind of locating where he was in the ether. And as I sat with that, I was flooded with images. And without going into full detail about the whole thing, because it would take a very, very long time, and I'm not sure how comfortable I am about talking about it, actually, but I saw I think in retrospect, I saw a lot of his different ways that he was going to approach committing suicide. I knew that he was going to take his life. I knew that was on the cards. I could see that he was still alive and well, until he wasn't. And actually, when he wasn't, that came in a dream. And again, without going into the whole dream, because there's no need to describe the whole thing, the dream was really significant. When you have those dreams where you're really lucid, and in the dream I was following his car, and I saw his license plate, and I read his license plate, and it was clear as day. And I recognized that was his vehicle, and he was driving towards my mom and dad's neighborhood, which would have been the house I lived in when we dated. And anyway, he pulled his car into this little space, and as he did that, he got out of the vehicle and started pulling lumber out of the car. And as I approached his vehicle and got to him, I approached him really, really slowly, and I called his name, and I said, it's Natalie, do you remember me? And when he turned to look at me, he was just crazed. He did not look like himself at all. He looked really crazed. I mean, it was definitely him. It was unmistakably him. He'd shaved his beard, but he had like several days growth coming through, and it was really unkempt, and his hair was he's kind of greasy and not looking real great, but he was wearing like his trademark, hat that he would wear, and clothes that I recognized. He bought new clothes about even less frequently than I do. So, and I wear stuff that I've been wearing for the last 15 years, or I'll buy stuff and not, buy new things for a long time. And he was very similar that way. And yeah, I mean, it was unmistakably him, but when he opened his mouth to speak, like all of this area right here was like blue black, and he was missing his two, 4 front teeth. They were all gone. They were just gone, which made no sense. He didn't have a drug habit. He wasn't, I didn't understand what was going on there, but he was like obsessively pulling 2x4s and lumber out of his car. um, and throwing it on the ground. And other people were there, like there were, this crowd of people that I didn't know or recognize were kind of descending and coming closer. It's just that I'd gotten there first, and they were all going to try and talk to him. And I realized there was just nothing I could do. And so I got in my car, walked back across the street, got in my car, drove the rest of the way through my neighborhood and home. And when I woke up the next morning, it was so vivid and so shocking and striking. I didn't quite know what to do with it. And I found out maybe a day and a half later that he had died. And then I had so many questions about maybe how he died because nobody wanted to talk about it. The family felt very protective about it. But I found out later through Google searches and so on that he had driven his car off of an interstate at full speed, sped up as fast as he could in order to complete, his choice. And that he had hit or driven into a parked train, and the rail car that he hit was filled with lumber. So, yeah, that was a really intense one. That was a really intense one. They happen pretty regularly. I don't usually don't tend to like poke the bear on purpose. But I think if you're a meditator and you're working with the psyche and you're at this point, actually after that experience, I worked with my therapist intensively around that. She tends to believe me when I talk about these things, and it was she, I think, who said finally, Natalie, do you want to work, do you need to find someone else to work with, who could really help you cultivate, these abilities and understand them better, understand what's needed better. Because what I was left with was, why, if he was in his death state when I saw him, which he kind of was, but kind of wasn't, why wasn't he burned? Because I know that the car went up in flames. That was what was described on the news where it happened. Why, when I was intellectualizing it after that, I was like, wow, did he shoot, did he have a gun? Because I don't remember him ever having a gun. Not that you can't get one easily, but, did he shoot himself? And maybe that's why that black was there and the teeth were gone? Because when he turned around, there was nothing, there was no exit wound. It was just trying to put together, like, what happened there? And I really couldn't put it together. It didn't make any sense to me until finding out about the rail car, about the lumber and the rail car. So I wasn't seeing him in his death state exactly. I was seeing him in his post-death state as he'd evolved into something, or was evolving into a different place, I think. And he was driving home. My house was on the way back to where he lived. He was driving home. And I guess my interest or my tendency to be upset and afraid and worried maybe drew him towards me or drew him closer. I don't know. It raised a lot of questions, like, what did I just see? And in part, I think it precipitated the movement towards becoming a Tibetan Buddhist because, I started to recognize, I wondered, after that, I wondered, like, did he become a hungry ghost? In Buddhist cosmology, someone who has a lot of unmet needs, wants, desires, etc., may die and find that those are the prevalent thing that survives the physical death. That's going to change the way that it's going to change. It's going to change things. And I'm not even going to pretend to say that I understand this or that I know anything about it, because I don't. I can tell you that, again, like the experiences I've had have been pretty fucked up. I mean, some have been pretty fucked up. And I didn't even talk about the time that I was still reading tarot cards and kind of shifting towards mediumship, and had a client. I put an ad in a paper, and when I was living in London, I had a woman come to my house, and she couldn't pay me at the end of the reading, so she gave me her passport, which was really weird. But it turns out the reason that she'd come to see me was because her partner had been murdered. And visually, I could see it play out. I could see the inside of their house. I could tell her where things were in her home. And I could see how that murder played out. I could see that he'd been stabbed repeatedly. I mean, it was just awful. It was fucked up. But I couldn't tell her who the murderer was. I could give her basic information. I had the guy there. It felt like chatting in my ear. She never came back for her passport. And so I never found out what happened. But I remembered thinking, okay, I might have to rethink how I vet people, how I vet clients, and see, how I read people. It was so tough. Oh, it was just, it's why I really think about, like, do I actually want to go back to reading again, or not? But, I feel like I'm in a much more responsible place at 43 than I was at 23. So, there's that. Yeah, there's that. I'd have better boundaries and a better way to anticipate that something like that could come up. But yeah, I mean, that's, I think, why I talk about, like, when I talk about these things, I talk about them, more in terms of, like, how do you cope with that? What do you do with that? I realized, like, last year after this situation with my ex, like, oh, I really need to rethink how I need to rethink these experiences, and I really need to rethink how I respond to them when they come up, because they don't, I get lots of, like, little things that happen here and there every day to a degree that I don't always really even notice them that much or pay much attention. But when the really big ones come up and they hit like that, I mean, that kind of shit will mess with you for a while. I'm still kind of messed up by it. I'm still processing it. I probably will be for a long time. I needed to know, like, how can I help him? If he's stuck in a really bad place, how do I help this person shift? And is it, how much of that is my responsibility? Because I've seen him, in that place pulling lumber out of his car, and having read more about, like, what is involved with someone that is inhabiting a realm of hungry ghosts, which really Zen practitioners didn't say much about. In the traditions that I was a part of, what do you do with that? Like, how do you help? And I started to realize, like, it's not just that I can't, I thought at that time, like, I can't be a Buddhist anymore. I don't know that I can stay with this tradition anymore because it's not serving my life. It's not serving the things that come up in my life. But at around that time too, I had also started to think, oh, I need to book a retreat. And I think I'll book a retreat with this Tibetan organization instead of another, like a Zen organization or insight meditation. And interestingly, I ended up at a retreat, and that's a whole other discussion on its own, but I ended up at a retreat with folks at Tara Mandala. And in fact, here I'm drinking my I Heart Chud mug, but Chud is one of the practices that I came into contact with through that tradition and organization that potentially could help, and could help the dead. It could help someone in those realms. And it offers more practice, through Tibetan Book of the Dead and, practices of Jitro and so on. It really gives, it gives you more tools to work with that will, that have an effect. They have a real effect. I mean, I have worked on some of that. I'm not practiced with Chud yet. I'm learning it. And it involves a lot of work with Dharma instruments and Tibetan chanting and so on. And I don't want to mess it up, really. But it's, yeah, that's how I've kind of gone on that journey. My journey through like how to deal with clairs has really led to like what kinds of new spiritual tools and implementations do I need in order to facilitate either self-care and growth, or in this case, like how do I serve? What can I do that's helpful to someone, who's in some way unresolved or trapped, perhaps, because I've come into contact with enough of that, or enough of something that looks like that for it to leave me with a lot more questions about what that is and how that works. So, the experiences themselves, what they mean, how to be with them, how to work with them, that requires a lot of care, a lot of care. It's not, so few of them are really as simple and just kind of funny as the first one I described about, there's a pip in it. That one's got a pip. The dates and the voice in my ear, A lot of the rest of them have been kind of heavy and had some significance. So anyway, God, that's long enough. 51 minutes. If you got through it to this point, you're doing well. So anyway, that's a few experiences. That's a few of the bigger, more significant ones over the last few years. And I hope they're helpful for whatever they're worth. All right. Take care. Bye.